The morning of June 6, 1944. 300 feet above the English Channel, Second Lieutenant Thomas Murphy gripped the control yoke of his Waco CG-4A glider. Behind him, squeezed into the plywood cargo bay, sat 13 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division. Ahead, tethered by 300 feet of nylon rope, a C-47 Dakota transport roared through the pre-dawn darkness, its twin engines drowning out everything except the thunder in Murphy's chest. The glider shuddered, canvas skin rippling over steel tube bones. No engine, no parachutes, no second chances. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Below, the black waters of the Channel gave way to the pale beaches of Normandy. German tracer fire arced upward like deadly fireflies, probing the sky for Allied bombers. But Murphy's glider was silent, invisible, a ghost carrying soldiers and a quarter-ton jeep into the heart of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The tow plane climbed to 1,000 feet. Murphy's co-pilot raised his hand, 3 fingers, 2. 1. The release lever snapped, the rope fell away, and suddenly, the Waco glider was alone, dropping toward Fortress Europe at 70 miles per hour, guided only by moonlight and the raw courage of a 24-year-old pilot who'd learned to fly just 8 months earlier. This wasn't supposed to be possible. A fabric-covered aircraft, built mostly of plywood and hope, landing behind enemy lines carrying the weight of a small truck. Yet by June of 1944, Allied forces had built nearly 14,000 of these engineless wonders. They'd solved problems that aviation experts said were impossible. They'd turned furniture factories into weapons plants. They'd trained 6,000 pilots to crash land on purpose. They'd created the silent wings that would deliver victory. But 3 years earlier, the idea of an American combat glider program didn't exist. The blueprint was chaos, the timeline was impossible, and the stakes were absolute. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Picture the scene. February 24, 1941. Wright Field, Ohio. The wind howling across the frozen tarmac, carrying the smell of engine oil and industrial ambition. Inside a drafty hangar, Major General Henry Hap Arnold, acting Deputy Chief of Staff for Air, stood before a blackboard covered in equations that promised the impossible. Build a glider, make it carry troops, have it ready before America enters the war everyone knows is coming. Arnold's hands were cold, not from the Ohio winter, but from the weight of what he was proposing. The German blitzkrieg through France had stunned the world. Not just the Panzers and Stukas, but the ghost-like DFS 230 gliders that had landed atop Belgium's Fort Eben Emael in May of 1940. 80 men in 10 gliders seized the fortress in 30 minutes. The impregnable fort fell before breakfast. The British were building their own response, the massive Horsa glider. But America had nothing. No gliders, no doctrine, no pilots, no time. Arnold issued classified technical instructions CTI 198 on that freezing February morning. The order was elegant in its desperation. Design and deliver assault gliders capable of being towed by aircraft. Carry combat troops and equipment. Make them fast, make them cheap, make them now. 11 aviation companies received the invitation, only 4 bothered to respond. Most manufacturers were already drowning in contracts for fighters, bombers, and transports. Why waste time on an aircraft with no engine? The suspense built like storm clouds over the Midwest. Could America actually pull this off? Waco Aircraft Company of Troy, Ohio, a small outfit that had built civilian pleasure planes before the war, submitted designs for 2 prototypes, the XCG-3, an 8-seater, and the XCG-4, designed to carry 15 men. Other firms tried and failed. Their gliders crumpled on landing or proved too fragile to withstand the stresses of towed flight. But Waco's design held. Steel tube fuselage, fabric covering, plywood wings with spruce spars, a hinged nose section that swung upward on chains, creating a cargo opening 60 inches wide and 70 inches tall. Load a jeep, load a howitzer, load 13 terrified men who'd volunteered for what veterans would later call flying coffins. The XCG-4 first flew in May of 1942. It worked, barely. Then came Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The shockwave didn't just sink battleships, it obliterated timelines. Overnight, the American glider program transformed from experimental curiosity into existential necessity. General Arnold's requirement jumped from 1,000 pilots to 6,000 by June of 1942. The procurement order exploded. 508-seaters, 515-seaters. Then the order doubled, then tripled. Waco Aircraft, a company that had employed fewer than 200 workers before the war, suddenly faced a contract to deliver thousands of combat gliders. But here's where the story turns strange. Waco couldn't do it alone. No aviation company could. Steel was rationed. Aluminum was spoken for. Every metalworking shop in America was already committed to tanks, ships, and powered aircraft. So the Army Air Forces made a decision that sounds insane until you realize it was brilliant. They turned to furniture makers. Think about it. A glider was essentially a flying box. Who knew how to build boxes? Who had vast supplies of wood? Who possessed the craftsmen capable of precise joinery, of bending plywood into curves, of finishing surfaces smooth enough to let air flow? Furniture companies, casket manufacturers, piano builders. By March of 1942, contracts went to the Ward Furniture Manufacturing Company of Fort Smith, Arkansas, to the Harris-Liebus Furniture Group in Britain, to Austin Motors, to Ford Motor Company's Kingsford plant in Michigan. In St. Paul, Minnesota, the Villaume Box and Lumber Company built wooden wings, while the DePonte Aviation Company down in Minneapolis fabricated steel fuselage frames and landing gear. Women who'd never touched an aircraft suddenly found themselves riveting tubular steel, covering wing surfaces with treated fabric, installing control cables that could mean the difference between a landing and a funeral. The factory floors hummed with the sound of saws and rivet guns, the sharp smell of aircraft dope and wood glue hanging in the air like the weight of history. But suspense mounted with every glider that rolled off the line. Would they actually fly? Would they hold together under the stress of combat? In October of 1942, Waco delivered its first production CG-4A. The designation was bureaucratic poetry: C for cargo, G for glider, 4 for the fourth design, A for the first production model, 48 feet long, 83 feet, 8 inches wingspan, empty weight, 3,900 pounds, maximum payload, 4,200 pounds, including crew, could carry 1 jeep and 4 soldiers, or 1 75mm howitzer and 3 crew, or 13 fully equipped infantrymen, or 6 stretcher cases for medical evacuation. The pilots sat side by side in a plexiglass cockpit perched atop the nose. Their instrument panel was Spartan: airspeed indicator, altimeter, turn and slip indicator, compass. That was it. No radio in early models. No engine instruments because there was no engine. Just 4 gauges and a stick between 2 pilots who'd signed up to fly an aircraft that travelled at 150 miles per hour while being towed, then slowed to 72 miles per hour in free glide. Landing speed, 60 miles per hour. Stall speed, 49 miles per hour. The margin between a successful landing and a catastrophic crash was 11 miles per hour, and a pilot's ability to judge height, speed, and distance, while anti-aircraft fire ripped through canvas skin. The CG-4A's construction was a marvel of improvisation. The fuselage frame was welded steel tubing, covered with cotton aircraft fabric treated with cellulose acetate dope that shrunk tight as a drum when it dried. The wings were plywood sheets over spruce ribs, covered with more doped fabric. The floor was honeycomb plywood, capable of supporting more than 4,000 pounds without buckling. The hinged nose, held aloft by 2 steel cables, could be unlatched and swung up in seconds. Load the jeep from the front, drive it out the front. No wrestling-heavy equipment through side doors. The landing gear was fixed tricycle type on early models. Nose wheel, 2 main wheels. Simple, reliable, heavy. Later production models incorporated droppable landing gear, release the wheels after takeoff to reduce drag and weight during tow, land on wooden skids bolted under the fuselage. The theory was sound. In practice, landing without wheels turned every field into a potential disaster. The spoilers mounted on the upper wing surface were the pilot's only way to control descent. Pull the lever, metal flaps popped up, disrupting airflow, increasing drag, steepening the glide path. Push the lever down, spoilers retracted. The glide flattened. It was crude. It worked. But nobody, not the engineers at Wright Field, not the furniture workers in Arkansas, not the pilots learning to fly at Sedalia Army Airfield in Missouri, could predict the true horror of combat. Training was chaos wrapped in optimism. Early pilot candidates were taken from the ranks of existing Army aviators. Men who'd washed out of powered flight training were given a second chance with gliders. When demand outstripped supply, the Army began direct recruiting of enlisted soldiers with no flight experience. The promise? Immediate promotion to staff sergeant upon graduation, flight training in 12 weeks. The reality was less glamorous. Initial training used recreational sailplanes. The TG-1, TG-2, TG-3, TG-4 tiny nimble craft that handled nothing like a 4-ton combat glider. It was like learning to drive on a motorcycle, then being handed the keys to a dump truck. Eventually, the Army procured proper training gliders, the TG-5A and TG-6A, and even modified light aircraft by removing engines and adding a third seat. But for many glider pilots, their first real test came not in the skies over Texas or Missouri, but in the darkness over Sicily, or the hedgerows of Normandy, where the only practice was live fire and the final exam was survival. By mid-1943, production was roaring. 16 companies, hundreds of subcontractors, 13,700 CG-4 as built by war's end. Each glider cost between $18,000 and $33,000, depending on the contractor. Ford's Kingsford plant alone built over 4,000. The price varied wildly. Quality varied even more. Some contractors excelled, others struggled. The General Aircraft Corporation of Astoria, New York, took a full year to deliver 513 gliders on their first contract. Their gliders averaged $33,770 each. A second contract for another 500 took another year. Price per glider? $28,000. These weren't precision aircraft rolling off a single assembly line. These were improvised weapons, built by companies learning on the fly, with blueprints numbering 2,500 pages, and tolerances measured in hope as much as inches. The problems multiplied. One contractor, the National Aircraft Company of Indiana, was nearly shut down in October of 1942 for having just 87 productive workers and 105 non-productive workers in an 82,000-square-foot facility. The owners sold to Christopher Engineering of St. Louis. The new owners arrived, gave the general manager 30 seconds to write his resignation, and when he refused, had the auxiliary military police eject him from the premises. Production didn't improve. Another contractor, E. Porterfield of Kansas City, wasn't even a company. It was an individual who promised he could build gliders, then formed a company, hired workers who claimed aircraft experience, and promptly sold the whole operation to Ward Furniture Manufacturing Company of Fort Smith. Ward tried building gliders and furniture simultaneously. It failed. They abandoned tables and chairs, focusing entirely on instruments of war. Quality remained below standard. Then came the St. Louis disaster, August of 1943, less than a year before D-Day. A contractor invited the mayor and 5,000 spectators to an air show featuring a glider demonstration. They watched, aghast, as a CG-4A lost a wing at 2,000 feet and spiraled into the ground in front of the grandstand. Everyone aboard died. Investigators ruled out sabotage. The cause? A faulty bolt provided by a subcontractor in the coffin business. The irony was not lost on the pilots, who'd already begun calling the CG-4A flying coffins and tow targets. The glider program nearly died that day. Congressional hearings loomed. The press demanded answers. How could America send men to war in plywood boxes held together by furniture makers and undertakers? But General Arnold didn't flinch. The program continued. Standards tightened, inspections intensified. By December of 1943, over 13,000 gliders had been produced, and the pilots, those 6,000 volunteers who wore wings with a capital G stamped in the center, waited for their orders. They knew the statistics. German losses on Crete in May of 1941 had been catastrophic. 5,140 airborne troops killed or wounded out of 13,000 sent. 350 aircraft destroyed, half of them Junkers, 52 transports. Hitler vowed never to use airborne forces in such large numbers again. The British had fared little better. Operation Freshman, an attempt to destroy Norway's heavy water plant in November of 1942, used 2 Horsa gliders towed by Halifax bombers. Both gliders crashed. All participants were killed or captured and executed. But the Allies had no choice. Amphibious landings required immediate support behind enemy lines. Paratroopers scattered over wide drop zones, taking hours to assemble. Gliders could land troops in concentrated groups, with their heavy weapons intact, ready to fight the moment the nose swung open. The suspense built through the spring of 1944. Where would the gliders strike first? Sicily? Italy? France? In the end, they went everywhere. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky. The invasion of Sicily. 137 American gliders participated. A handful reached their landing zones. Many were released too early by inexperienced tow crews and ditched in the Mediterranean. Men drowned in gliders that sank like stones. Others crash-landed on rocks, in vineyards, among olive groves. The casualty rate was horrific, but lessons were learned. Tow crews received better training. Release altitudes were standardized. Glider construction improved. Radio communications, absent in early models, were gradually added. By June of 1944, the Allied glider force was ready for its greatest test. Operation Overlord, D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. On the evening of June 5, 1944, 2 glider operations launched from England. Operation Chicago, 52 CG-4. As towed by the 434th Troop Carrier Group, carried reinforcements for the 101st Airborne Division. Operation Detroit, another. 52 gliders towed by the 437th Troop Carrier Group supported the 82nd Airborne Division. Each glider carried 13 men and gear, or 4 men and cargo, jeeps, howitzers, ammunition, medical supplies. One glider carried Brigadier General Don Pratt, second in command of the 101st Airborne. His glider, named Fighting Falcon, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Mike Murphy, crossed the channel in darkness. At 4 a.m., Murphy cut loose at 600 feet. He could see nothing. No landmarks, no lights. Just the black outline of hedgerows and the faint glimmer of flooded fields. The Horsa glider, yes. Murphy was flying a British Horsa, larger and heavier than the American Waco, smashed through a hedgerow and slammed into a tree. The impact snapped the fuselage. General Pratt died instantly, crushed in the wreckage. His death was a serious blow to the 101st Airborne. Murphy survived, along with most of his passengers. They crawled from the shattered glider, grabbed their weapons, and joined the infantry assault. The 101st Airborne lost 30 men in glider crashes on D-Day. The 82nd lost nearly 300. Total American airborne casualties on June 6th, 2,499, killed, wounded, or missing. Yet the gliders succeeded. They delivered troops, jeeps, howitzers, anti-aircraft guns directly to drop zones that paratroopers had secured hours earlier. The heavy weapons changed everything. German counterattacks, which might have overrun scattered paratrooper positions, instead met concentrated fire from 75mm guns that had arrived by glider. By dawn on June 7th, over 3,937 glider infantrymen had landed in Normandy. They'd lost gliders, 21 Wacos wrecked on landing, along with countless Horsas, but the mission succeeded. The Allies had established a foothold. The gliders had delivered, but the war was far from over. And the most ambitious, most disastrous glider operation in history was just 3 months away. September 17th, 1944, Operation Market Garden. The plan was audacious. 3 Allied airborne divisions, American, British, Polish, would seize bridges across the Netherlands, opening a corridor for British armour to race into Germany's industrial heartland. The airborne operation, codenamed Market, would be the largest in history, over 35,000 paratroopers, nearly 2,000 gliders. The British 1st Airborne Division drew the toughest assignment: drop near Arnhem, 60 miles behind German lines, and hold the bridge over the Rhine until ground forces arrived. Intelligence suggested only light German resistance. In reality, 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the area. The British landed in daylight. Their landing zones were 11 kilometres from the Arnhem Bridge. Only 1 battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the objective. They held the north end of the bridge for 4 days. No relief came. German tanks and infantry surrounded them. Artillery pounded their positions. The gliders kept coming. Day 2, Day 3. Horses and Wacos landed under fire, disgorging troops, guns, supplies. Many gliders were shot down during approach. Others crashed into obstacles, trees, buildings. The troops fought from hedgerows, from ruined houses, from shallow slit trenches that offered little protection from mortar fire. By September 25th, the battle was lost. Of the 10,000 men from the 1st Airborne Division who'd landed at Arnhem, only 2,100 escaped across the Rhine. 7,500 were dead, wounded, or captured. The glider pilot regiment lost over 200 men killed. The suspense had turned to tragedy. Yet even in defeat, the gliders had performed their impossible mission. They'd landed troops in concentrated groups, delivered heavy weapons under fire, and given the infantry a 7th fighting chance against overwhelming odds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After Market Garden, the glider program faced a crisis of confidence. Were these fragile aircraft worth the cost in lives? General Dwight Eisenhower thought so. So did General George Patton. So did the infantry soldiers who'd fought alongside glider troops and seen their courage firsthand. The program continued. Gliders supported the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. 11 CG-4, as landed inside the 101st Airborne's perimeter on December 26th, delivering medical staff, gasoline, artillery ammunition. 50 more arrived the next day. No losses. Perfect landings under pressure. Then came the final test, Operation Varsity, March 24th, 1945, the crossing of the Rhine, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. Over 21,000 glider troops and paratroopers, supported by more than 1,600 gliders and transport aircraft, landed on the German side of the Rhine to secure Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's crossing points. This time, the planning was meticulous. Lessons from Sicily, Normandy, and Market Garden had been learned. Gliders would be released closer to landing zones. Tow crews had months of additional training. The aircraft American CG-4, as British Horsas, even a few massive General Aircraft Hamilcars capable of carrying light tanks descended in broad daylight. German anti-aircraft fire was intense. Flak burst among the glider formations. Some aircraft exploded in mid-air, others crash-landed in flames, but the majority reached their zones. Troops poured out, jeeps roared across German fields. Howitzers began firing within minutes of landing. By nightfall, the Rhine crossing was secure. Glider casualties were significant, over 600 killed or wounded, but acceptable compared to earlier operations. The gliders had proven their worth one final time. In the Pacific Theatre, gliders saw limited use. The 1st Air Commando Group employed CG-4, as in Burma, landing supplies and even mules deep in the jungle to support Chindit Special Operations Forces. Some mules panicked. Soldiers were ordered to shoot the first animal that broke loose. Very few misbehaved. The final American glider mission occurred in June of 1945 during the retaking of Luzon in the Philippines. The 88th Glider Infantry Regiment landed by glider to support the 11th Airborne Division. It was the only combat operation to use the larger CG-13 glider, capable of carrying 30 troops. Then the war ended. August 15, 1945. Victory over Japan. The glider program, born in desperation in February of 1941, died quietly in the peace of 1946. Between 6,000 and 7,000 pilots had been trained, nearly 14,000 American gliders built. Casualties among glider pilots and crews were among the highest in the war. 37% casualty rate in some operations. No parachutes, no engines, no second chances. Yet they'd delivered 30,000 troops to combat zones. They'd transported jeeps, howitzers, bulldozers, ammunition, medical supplies. They'd won battles. They'd saved lives. They'd changed warfare. By January 1, 1953, the U.S. Army deleted glider operations from its capabilities. Helicopters could do the job better. Larger transport aircraft could drop supplies by parachute. The era of the silent wings was over. But the gliders didn't vanish entirely. Some were converted to civilian use. A few became crop dusters. Others rotted in surplus yards, their plywood bones collapsing under sun and rain. Today, fewer than a dozen complete CG-4, as survive in museums, restored, preserved, silent witnesses to an era when men flew into battle in wooden boxes held together by fabric, faith, and the desperate ingenuity of a nation at war. The engineering challenge had seemed impossible in February of 1941. Build an aircraft with no engine, make it carry the weight of a truck, train thousands of pilots in months, trust furniture makers to build weapons of war. Yet America did it, not perfectly, not without tragedy, but they did it. The Waco CG-4A could carry 13 troops, or 1 jeep plus 4 soldiers, or a 75mm howitzer. It could land in fields too small for powered aircraft. It could approach in silence, invisible to enemy radar, audible only in the final seconds before touchdown. It cost $18,000 to $33,000, depending on who built it, a bargain compared to the price of defeat. The British Horser could carry 28 troops, or a jeep and crew or 2 universal carriers. Larger, heavier, built almost entirely of wood by furniture manufacturers pressed into service, nearly 3,700 built. The massive Hamilcar could carry a light tank, 412 built. Too few, too late for most operations, but impressive in its ambition. Together, these gliders represented a revolution in military logistics. The ability to land concentrated forces, with their heavy weapons, directly at objectives behind enemy lines. The paratroopers got the glory. The glider pilots got a capital G on their wings, and the knowledge that they'd flown into history aboard the most dangerous aircraft of the war. The hook of this story isn't the technology, it's the audacity, the sheer, bloody-minded determination to solve an impossible problem because the alternative was losing a war. In early 1941, America had no combat glider program. By mid-1944, it had 14,000 gliders and 6,000 pilots. Furniture companies were building aircraft, coffin makers were supplying parts, women were riveting steel, and young men were volunteering to fly machines with no engines, no parachutes, and no promises, except the certainty that their missions mattered. They called themselves suicide jockeys. The infantry called them heroes. The official designation was glider pilot. But everyone knew the truth. The G on their wings didn't stand for glider. It stood for guts. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But let's rewind, because the story of how these gliders actually worked, how they defied physics and common sense, deserves a deeper look. Picture yourself in the cockpit of a CG-4A on the morning of June 6, 1944. You're Second Lieutenant Donald McRae, 23 years old, from Michigan. You've been a glider pilot for exactly 9 months. Your training consisted of 12 weeks learning to fly sailplanes, followed by a handful of practice flights in actual combat gliders. No simulators, no advanced instrumentation, just you, a plywood box, and the promise that your tow pilot knows what he's doing. The pre-flight briefing was 3 hours ago. You know your landing zone is a field designated LZE, somewhere near Sainte-Mère-Église. You know it's supposed to be 200 yards long. You know the French resistance reported it clear of obstacles 2 days ago. What you don't know is that 24 hours ago, German engineers began studding that field with Rommel's asparagus wooden poles 10 to 15 feet tall, designed specifically to rip the wings off landing gliders. You don't know that the field is actually bordered by 40-foot trees that somehow got labelled as hedgerows on your map. You don't know that a German machine gun nest is dug in exactly where your glider will slide to a stop. You know none of this. You know only that your cargo bay contains 1 jeep, 4 soldiers from the 327th glider, infantry regiment, and enough ammunition to hold a position for maybe 6 hours. You know that if everything goes right, you'll land, swing open the nose, drive out the jeep, and fight as infantry until reinforcements arrive. You know that if everything goes wrong, you'll die before you hear the impact. The C-47 tow plane throttles up. The nylon rope snaps taut. Your glider lurches forward, wooden wings flexing, steel frame groaning. The ground falls away and suddenly you're airborne, connected to salvation by a 1-inch rope and 300 feet of hope. The noise is unbelievable. Veterans of the glider program would later dispute the nickname "silent wings," with vehemence bordering on rage. Silent? Inside that plywood box, you hear everything. The roar of the C-47's engines transmitted through the tow rope like a telephone line made of thunder. The whistle of wind through gaps in the fabric skin. The creak of wooden spars bending under aerodynamic loads they were never designed to sustain. The rattle of tie-down chains securing the jeep. The breathing of the 4 soldiers behind you, each man locked in his own private terror. And over it all, once you cross the French coast, the sound of German 88mm anti-aircraft guns punching holes in the sky. You're at 1,000 feet. The formation stretches ahead of you, 52 gliders in tight trail, each one a target, each one committed to a landing zone that might not exist. The tow pilot's job is to get you close. Your job is everything else: navigation, altitude control, airspeed management, landing approach. And oh yes, don't get shot down. The release point approaches. Your co-pilot, a 20-year-old kid from Texas who's never been in combat, raises his hand. You see the gesture in your peripheral vision. 3 fingers. The tow rope will release in 3 seconds. 2 fingers. You push the control yoke forward slightly, adding a touch of tension to the rope so the release will be clean. 1 finger. Every muscle in your body tightens. 0. The release lever snaps. The rope falls away, trailing behind the C-47 like a severed umbilical cord. And just like that, you're alone. The sudden silence, relative silence, because the wind still howls and the anti-aircraft guns still thunder, is disorienting. Your airspeed is 120 miles per hour. You bank left, away from the tow plane, looking for your landmarks, looking for anything familiar in a landscape you've studied only in photographs. There. The church spire at Sainte-Mère-Église, visible in the pre-dawn light. You orient yourself. The landing zone should be northwest, maybe 2 miles. You have perhaps 3 minutes of glide time at this altitude. You need to bleed off airspeed. You pull the spoiler lever. The metal flaps on top of your wings pop up with a bang that feels like a gunshot. The glider shudders, nose dipping, descent rate increasing. 600 feet per minute. 800, 1,000. The ground rushes up. You see the field. You see the wooden poles. Your stomach drops. There's no other option, no other field. No going around for another approach. You aim between the poles, threading a needle at 70 miles per hour in semi-darkness, while tracers arc across your windscreen. The trees. God, those trees. Nobody mentioned 40-foot trees. You pull back on the yoke, the glider flares, the descent slows. You're 20 feet up, 15, 10. The wooden skids you'd dropped the landing gear 2 minutes ago to reduce drag bite into the French earth. The glider bounces, slams down again, the nose plows into a hedgerow, the fuselage bucks like a dying animal. Something snaps, the plywood floor splits, the Jeep lurches forward, its front bumper stopping inches from the back of your seat. And then, stillness. You're alive. Behind you, the 4 soldiers are already moving, kicking open the side doors, weapons ready. Your co-pilot's hands are shaking so badly he can't unbuckle in his harness. You help him. Together, you crawl out of the cockpit and into history. This was the reality for thousands of glider pilots. Every mission was a controlled crash. Every landing was a gamble. The CG-4A's landing characteristics were charitably unforgiving. The glider had a glide ratio of 15:1. For every 15 feet forward, you descended 1 foot. Seems reasonable until you realize that at 600 feet altitude, a typical release height, you had exactly 9,000 feet, less than 2 miles, to find your landing zone, assess obstacles, plan your approach, and execute a landing that would probably destroy your aircraft. The British Horsa was slightly better. Larger wings gave it a glide ratio of 17:1, but the extra size meant higher wing loading, which meant faster landing speeds, which meant harder impacts. The Horsa could carry 28 troops compared to the Waco's 13, but the cost was measured in broken ankles, crushed ribs, and deaths from internal injuries sustained in landings that technically succeeded. Consider the physics. A loaded CG-4A weighed about 7,500 pounds at takeoff. That's the weight of 3 small cars, suspended beneath fabric-covered wings with a total area of 852 square feet. Wing loading, 8.8 pounds per square foot. For comparison, a modern Cessna 172 has a wing loading of 14 pounds per square foot and lands at 55 miles per hour on paved runways with brakes. The glider landed at 60 miles per hour on unprepared fields with no brakes, just wooden skids and prayer. The energy of impact was enormous. At 60 miles per hour, the glider had a kinetic energy of roughly 1.4 million foot-pounds. All of that energy had to be absorbed by the landing gear or later models, by the wooden skids, and by the structure of the glider itself. Plywood splintered, steel tubes buckled, fabric ripped. In training, gliders could and sometimes be repaired and flown again. In combat, 97% were abandoned in the field, too damaged to recover, too dangerous to reuse. The army had developed a recovery system. It was ingenious and absolutely terrifying. Picture this: a glider lands successfully. It's needed for another mission, maybe to evacuate wounded. Ground crews set up 2 poles, like football goalposts, about 15 feet apart. They string the glider's tow rope between these poles in a loop. A C-47 transport flies low and slow, trailing a hook from its tail. The hook snags the loop. The glider goes from stationary to 100 miles per hour in about 3 seconds. The stress is incredible. The glider airframe creaks and groans. Sometimes it holds together, sometimes it doesn't. If the glider fails structurally during the snatch, it's usually too low for the crew to bail out, assuming they have parachutes, which they often don't to save weight, and too high to survive the fall. The technique was used primarily by the 1st Air Commando Group in the China-Burma-India theatre. It worked just well enough to be employed operationally, but the casualty rate kept it from widespread adoption. Meanwhile, back in the factories, production continued at a frantic pace. By mid-1943, the United States was building CG-4 as faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. The Ford Motor Company's Kingsford plant in Michigan became a marvel of mass production. Henry Ford's assembly line philosophy applied to gliders. Workers fabricated fuselage sections in jigs. Wing panels arrived from subcontractors. Everything bolted together in a sequence that would have made the Model T production line look primitive. Ford built 4,190 gliders between 1942 and 1945. Average cost, $24,500. Time from raw materials to flyable glider, approximately 6 weeks per unit. Compare that to the British Horsa, Production began in early 1942. By war's end, approximately 3,600 had been built by Airspeed Limited and various subcontractors, but the Horsa's construction was more complex. The fuselage was built in 3 sections and bolted together. The wooden wings were handcrafted by furniture workers who'd never built an aircraft before. Quality varied wildly. Some Horsas were magnificent tight joints, smooth surfaces, controls that responded crisply. Others were death traps, weak joints, warped wood, control cables that jammed at the worst possible moments. American glider pilots forced to fly Horsas had mixed opinions. The Horsa was roomier, it could carry more troops. The hinged nose on the Mark II version made loading vehicles much easier, but it was also heavier, less maneuverable, and required a longer landing run. In the confined fields of Normandy, that extra landing distance often meant the difference between stopping short of a tree line and ploughing through it at 40 miles per hour. By September of 1944, glider operations had evolved into a brutal science. The mistakes of Sicily early releases, poor navigation, scattered landings had been corrected. The tragedies of Normandy, inadequate intelligence about obstacles, insufficient training for tow crews had been studied and addressed. Operation Market Garden, despite its ultimate failure, demonstrated just how far the glider program had come. On September 17, 1944, the first day of Market Garden, over 1,200 gliders participated. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions deployed with fewer casualties than Normandy. Better training, better coordination, better intelligence. The British 1st Airborne at Arnhem suffered catastrophically, but not because of glider failures. The gliders performed exactly as designed. They landed under fire. They delivered troops, jeeps, anti-tank guns, supplies. Tragedy at Arnhem was strategic and operational landing zones too far from objectives, intelligence failures about German strength, communication breakdowns between ground and air forces. The gliders did their job. The plan failed. 200 soldiers of the glider pilot regiment died at Arnhem. They died fighting as infantry, which was always part of their mission profile. Land the glider, unload the troops and equipment, grab your rifle, and fight. Glider pilots weren't just aviators, they were infantrymen who happened to arrive by air. They received basic infantry training, they carried weapons, and they were expected to fight until relieved or killed. At Arnhem, relief never came. The glider pilots dug slit trenches around their landing zones and held off German counterattacks for 9 days. They ran out of ammunition, they ran out of food, they ran out of water, they never ran out of courage. When the evacuation order came on September 25th, many glider pilots couldn't reach the Rhine crossing point. They were captured, killed, or went into hiding with the Dutch underground. Some escaped in Operation Pegasus on October 22nd, a daring rescue mission that brought out 140 Allied troops who'd been sheltered by Dutch civilians. By March of 1945, the lessons of 3 years of combat operations had been distilled into doctrine. Operation Varsity, the Rhine crossing, was executed with a precision that earlier operations could only dream of. 1,600 gliders, 21,000 troops, all delivered in a single day. The planning was meticulous. Landing zones were selected based on aerial reconnaissance, verified by reconnaissance teams, and marked by pathfinders who jumped hours before the main assault. Tow crews flew practice missions over England, rehearsing navigation, release points, and emergency procedures. Glider pilots received detailed briefings, complete with scale models of the landing zones, photographs of obstacles, and expected enemy positions. The result? Operation Varsity succeeded. The gliders delivered their troops within minutes of the planned schedule. Casualties were significant but acceptable. The Rhine was crossed. The road into Germany was open. It was the glider program's final validation. From the chaos of Sicily in July 1943 to the precision of Varsity in March 1945, the evolution was remarkable. The gliders hadn't changed much. They were still plywood and fabric, still engineless, still dangerous. But the doctrine had matured, the training had improved, the pilots had learned, and the aircraft, for all their flaws, had proven their worth. After the war, The gliders faded quickly from memory. Helicopters emerged as the future of vertical assault. The Sikorsky R-4, R-5, and R-6 helicopters saw limited service in World War II, primarily for medical evacuation and reconnaissance. But by the Korean War, helicopters like the Sikorsky H-19 could carry troops and supplies, land them, and then extract them. No more one-way missions, no more crash landings. The glider became obsolete overnight. By January of 1953, the U.S. Army officially ended glider operations. The 6,000 trained glider pilots dispersed. Some became helicopter pilots, others left military aviation entirely. Many carried physical and psychological scars from missions that demanded skills no training could fully prepare them for. The gliders themselves met various fates. Some were scrapped for materials, others were sold as surplus. A few became agricultural aircraft crop dusters and spray planes powered by small engines bolted to the nose. The irony of adding engines to gliders wasn't lost on the pilots who'd flown them in combat. Today, surviving CG-4, as are treasured museum pieces. The National Museum of the United States Air Force displays one. The Airborne and Special Operations Museum in Fayetteville, North Carolina, has another. The Air Mobility Command Museum preserves a third. Each glider represents not just technology, but human courage. These weren't sophisticated aircraft. They were improvised solutions to an immediate problem, built by furniture makers and flown by young men who understood that every mission might be their last. The engineering achievement was real, taking an industry furniture manufacturing and repurposing it for weapons production in less than a year, designing an aircraft that could be built with minimal metal in an era when metal was precious, creating a training program that turned civilians into combat pilots in 12 weeks. These were genuine accomplishments. But the real story isn't the engineering, it's the people. The 19-year-old farm kid from Iowa who volunteered for glider training because it came with a promotion to staff sergeant. The furniture worker in Arkansas who'd never seen an airplane up close, suddenly riveting steel tubes and stretching fabric over plywood ribs. The tow pilots who flew C-47 seconds across the English Channel in darkness, towing 2 gliders each, navigating by dead reckoning while German flak burst around them. The infantry soldiers who climbed into those plywood boxes and trusted that the pilot would get them to the landing zone alive, and the pilots themselves. 6,000 men who wore wings with a G in the center, who flew aircraft with no engines, no parachutes, and no second chances, who landed in darkness on fields they'd never seen, often under fire, always with the knowledge that the landing would probably destroy their aircraft and might kill them. They called it the G for guts. They earned it. Every single one of them earned it. The glider program lasted exactly 4 years in its intensive form, February 1941 to May 1945. In that time, it changed warfare. It proved that heavy equipment could be delivered directly to frontline positions without airstrips. It demonstrated that furniture makers could build military aircraft. It showed that young men with minimal training could execute missions requiring extraordinary skill and courage. The CG-4A, the Horsa, the Hamilcar, these weren't elegant solutions. They were desperate ones, built in haste, flown in terror, abandoned in fields across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. But they worked, not perfectly, not safely, but they worked, and in the crucible of World War II, when the margin between victory and defeat measured in hours and inches, working was enough. The hook of this story, the thing that makes it matter 80 years later, is this. When the problem seems impossible, when the timeline is absurd, when conventional wisdom says it can't be done, you do it anyway. You turn furniture factories into aircraft plants. You train pilots in weeks instead of years. You build aircraft out of plywood and hope. You fly them into battle knowing the odds are terrible. And somehow, improbably, you win. That's the legacy of the silent wings. Not the silence, there was no silence, just noise and terror and courage. But the wings, the improbable, improvised, impossible wings that carried an army to victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.